They're about to kill him. The injection is ready. 15 minutes left. The giant calf stands in the corner, condemned by numbers on a screen. The system said he was defective, worthless, a mistake, and everyone believed it, except one person nobody listened to. But what the janitor's 12-year-old son noticed, the experts completely missed. A flaw so obvious, yet invisible to everyone who mattered, because they were looking at data, while he was watching the truth. When the boy exposed what the system got wrong, it shook everything they believed. And what they discovered in those final minutes would prove that sometimes the biggest mistake isn't in the numbers. It's in who we choose to ignore. The calf was born at 3:47 a.m. under fluorescent lights that never acknowledged day or night. Samuel heard the commotion from the janitor's closet, where his father kept a cot for nights when work ran late and home felt too far away. Voices carried down the sterile corridors, excitement first, then confusion, then something that sounded like disappointment. He was 12 years old and technically shouldn't have been there at all, but Genesis Genetics didn't pay attention to the janitor's kids sleeping in storage rooms. They paid attention to numbers, projections, genetic markers that promised profit. They paid attention to everything except the people who kept their floors clean and their waste bins empty. Samuel's father Daniel had worked at Genesis for 8 years, mopping the same hallways where men in white coats made decisions worth millions. He'd taught his son to be invisible, to move quietly, to understand that their presence was tolerated only because someone had to clean up after brilliance. But Samuel had never been good at being invisible. He watched. He listened. He absorbed information the way the facility's drains absorbed chemical runoff, constantly, quietly, without anyone noticing until something went wrong. The voices grew louder near the birthing suite. Samuel crept closer, staying in shadows that his father had taught him to navigate. Through the observation window, he saw them gathered around a newborn calf that looked wrong in ways that made his chest tight. The calf was massive. Not just large for a newborn, genuinely massive, his body almost twice the size of normal cattle births. His legs were thick as fence posts, his chest barrel wide, his head blocky and oversized. He stood on shaking limbs within minutes of birth, which should have been impressive, but the men in white coats looked at him the way people look at mistakes. Mr. Thompson stood at the center of the group, his tablet glowing with data that apparently told him everything he needed to know. He was the chief evaluator for the Evaluators, the algorithmic system that assessed every calf born at Genesis, determining value within hours of birth. The system measured bone density, muscle composition, growth projections, feed efficiency ratios. It predicted adult weight, meat quality, reproductive viability. It decided futures before calves had names. Genetic anomaly. Thompson's voice carried clinical detachment. The algorithm flagged him immediately. Growth hormone irregularity, skeletal structure outside acceptable parameters, projected adult weight exceeding facility capacity by 40%. Mr. Johnson, the facility director, leaned closer to the window. He's strong, though. Look at him. Strong isn't the same as valuable. Thompson swiped through screens. The Evaluators have never been wrong. This calf will require specialized feed, reinforced housing, equipment modifications we're not equipped to handle. His meat-to-bone ratio will be suboptimal. His size makes him unmarketable to standard buyers. He paused. The system recommends immediate termination. Samuel's hands pressed against cold glass. The calf, already condemned before he'd taken 10 breaths, stood in the center of the birthing suite, massive and ungainly, and somehow beautiful in his strangeness. His mother licked him with the kind of attention that didn't care about algorithms or projections. When? Johnson's question was quiet. Protocol says within 72 hours of rejection. That seems... Johnson trailed off, but he didn't finish the thought. Nobody argued with the Evaluators. The system had revolutionized the industry, turned guesswork into science, made Genesis the most profitable genetics facility in 3 states. You didn't question the algorithm that paid your salary. The men filed out, already discussing the next scheduled birth, the rejected calf forgotten before they'd left the room. Samuel stayed at the window, watching the massive newborn explore his small world with clumsy steps, unaware that his world had an expiration date measured in hours. His father found him there 20 minutes later, mop in hand, moving with the practiced silence of someone who'd spent years not being noticed. "Samuel, you shouldn't be here. They're going to kill him." Daniel glanced through the window, his expression unchanged. He'd seen this before. Genesis was in the business of perfection, and perfection required eliminating mistakes. "That's not our concern, son." "But he's not even sick. He's just big." "The system knows better than us." His father's voice carried the resignation of someone who'd learned not to question things beyond his pay grade. "Come on, I need to clean the west wing before shift change." Samuel followed, but he looked back at the calf one more time. The massive newborn had settled next to his mother, his oversized head resting against her flank. In 3 days, maybe less, he'd be gone. Removed. Processed into whatever they did with genetic mistakes. The evaluators had spoken. The system had decided. And everyone at Genesis Genetics had learned not to argue with the system. Everyone except a 12-year-old janitor's son who'd spent his life watching from the margins, noticing things that important people missed because they were too busy looking at screens to see what was right in front of them. That night, Samuel lay on the cot in his father's closet, staring at ceiling tiles that his father had probably cleaned 1,000 times. He thought about the calf, already massive, already strong, already condemned. He thought about the way Thompson had dismissed him with numbers and projections, the way Johnson had almost questioned before choosing silence. He thought about how many times he'd heard them talk about the evaluators like it was infallible, like its judgments were gospel written in code instead of stone. And he wondered what happened when the system was wrong. Nobody had considered that possibility. Nobody dared. But Samuel was just the janitor's son. He wasn't important enough to be afraid of asking dangerous questions. Not yet, anyway. Samuel wasn't supposed to be in the livestock observation wing. That section belonged to technicians and evaluators, people whose names appeared on doors and whose opinions mattered in meetings. But his father cleaned those halls every morning at 5 a.m., before the important people arrived, and Samuel had learned that if you carried cleaning supplies and kept your head down, you could go almost anywhere. He'd thought about Behemoth all night. The image of that massive calf standing on shaking legs, condemned before he'd lived a full day, had lodged itself somewhere behind Samuel's ribs where it ached like a bruise. He couldn't explain why it mattered so much. Maybe because he understood what it felt like to be dismissed, to have your value determined by people who never looked closely enough to see you. The birthing suite was empty when Samuel arrived, his father 30 feet away mopping the main corridor. Through the observation window, Behemoth stood next to his mother in the holding pen. In just 36 hours, he'd grown noticeably larger. His legs had thickened, his chest had broadened, his movements had gained coordination that seemed impossible for something so young. Samuel pressed his forehead against the glass, watching. The calf moved with purpose now, exploring every corner of his limited space. When he walked, his hooves struck the ground with weight that resonated through the floor. When he turned his head, his neck muscles rippled under skin that seemed too tight for the body underneath. "You're not supposed to be here." Samuel spun around. Mr. Walker stood in the doorway, one of the junior evaluators who actually noticed when things were out of place. He was younger than Thompson or Johnson, maybe 30, with the kind of face that still remembered questioning things before learning not to. "I'm sorry, sir. My dad's cleaning and I..." Walker's expression softened slightly. "You're Daniel's kid. Samuel, right?" "Yes, sir." The evaluator walked to the window, standing beside Samuel. They both looked at Behemoth, who was currently investigating his water trough with intense concentration. "He's something, isn't he?" Walker's voice carried something that might have been regret. "Biggest calf I've seen in 6 years here. Strongest, too, probably." "Then why?" Samuel caught himself, but Walker didn't seem offended by the half-formed question. "Because the evaluators say so." Walker pulled out his tablet, pulling up data that meant nothing to Samuel. "See these numbers? Growth projection puts him at 2,800 pounds by 18 months. That's 40% above optimal. Feed costs alone would exceed profit margins. And his bone density, He paused, frowning at the screen. His bone density is off the charts. System flags that as structural instability risk. Samuel looked at Behemoth, who'd figured out how to drink and was now slurping water with the enthusiasm of someone discovering a new favorite thing. He doesn't look unstable. The algorithm accounts for variables we can't see, future complications, hidden weaknesses. It processes 10,000 data points we don't have time to analyze manually. Walker swiped through screens. It's never been wrong, Samuel. Not once in 4 years of implementation. What if it is, though? The question hung in the air between them. Walker looked at Samuel with an expression that suggested he'd asked something dangerous, something that didn't get asked at Genesis Genetics. It's not. But his voice lacked conviction. Walker left shortly after, called away by his radio for some evaluation in the south wing. Samuel stayed at the window, watching Behemoth with new intensity. The calf had moved on from water to investigating the hay feeder, his massive head pushing through openings designed for normal-sized cattle. He got stuck briefly, then backed out with a patience that seemed almost human. Over the next 3 hours, while his father worked and the facility woke up around them, Samuel watched Behemoth navigate his world. He watched the way the calf learned from mistakes, the way he adapted his movements to account for his size, the way he interacted with his mother with a gentleness that contradicted his bulk. And he noticed something. Behemoth's right front leg. The system had flagged it as structurally compromised in the bone density scan. Thompson had mentioned it during the rejection discussion, pointing to data that suggested future lameness, potential collapse under excessive weight. But when Behemoth walked, that leg didn't favor. When he ran, and he did run, in short bursts around the pen, that leg struck the ground with the same force as the others. When he stood still, his weight distributed evenly across all 4 legs. No shifting, no compensation. Samuel had spent his whole life watching his father work with a bad knee, the result of an injury that never healed properly. He knew what compromised structure looked like, how people favored damaged limbs, adjusted their movements, protected weak points. Behemoth didn't do any of that. The door opened again. This time it was Thompson, with Johnson following close behind. They didn't notice Samuel, who'd learned the trick of becoming furniture when necessary, shrinking into corners until he was just another fixture in rooms he wasn't supposed to occupy. Scheduled for this afternoon, Thompson was saying, his tablet already displaying the relevant forms. Mobile processing unit arrives at 3. We'll handle it during shift change when fewer staff are around. Less disruption. Johnson nodded, but he stopped at the window, looking at Behemoth the way someone might look at something they wanted to save but didn't know how. He's thriving, though. Look at him. Doesn't matter. The evaluators made the call. We can't keep genetic mistakes just because they look healthy right now. The algorithm sees things we don't. What if we ran a secondary evaluation, just to... The system doesn't require secondary evaluations. That's the whole point. Thompson's voice carried the impatience of someone who'd had this conversation before. We trust the data, Michael. The moment we start second-guessing the algorithm, we might as well go back to the old way. Expensive, slow, wrong half the time. Johnson's shoulders sagged slightly. I know. You're right. They left together, already discussing the next item on their agenda. Behemoth's execution reduced to a scheduling detail between meetings. Samuel stayed frozen in his corner for a full minute after they'd gone, his heart hammering against his ribs. 3 p.m. That's when they'd come for him. He thought about what Walker had said. The evaluators had never been wrong. He thought about the way Thompson dismissed any possibility of error with the certainty of someone whose job depended on not asking questions. He thought about Behemoth's right front leg, the one the system said was compromised, the one that worked perfectly fine. And Samuel made a decision that would have terrified him if he'd stopped to think about it. He was going to prove the system was wrong. He had 6 hours to figure out how. Samuel found Mr. Walker first because he seemed like the one who might listen. The junior evaluator was in the data analysis room, surrounded by monitors displaying genetic sequences and projection models. Samuel knocked on the open door frame, his heart racing so fast he could feel it in his throat. Walker looked up, surprised. Samuel, you really shouldn't be in this wing. It's about Behemoth, the calf. I've been watching him, and there's something wrong with the evaluation. The words tumbled out faster than Samuel could organize them. Walker's expression shifted from surprise to something like concern, but not the kind Samuel needed. It was the concern adults gave kids who didn't understand how the world worked. Samuel, I know it's hard to see an animal get put down, but the evaluators. His leg isn't compromised. The system said his right front leg has structural instability, but I watched him for 3 hours. He runs on it, stands on it. There's no favoring, no weakness. The scan must have been wrong. Walker set down his stylus, giving Samuel his full attention now. The bone density scans don't lie. They measure cellular composition at a microscopic level. If the algorithm flagged structural instability, there's a reason. But I watched him. You watched him for 3 hours. The algorithm processed 4 years of data from thousands of cattle, identifying patterns that predict future failures. What you saw is temporary. In 6 months, maybe a year, that leg would collapse under his weight. Walker's voice was gentle but firm. The system sees things we can't, Samuel. That's why we trust it. What if you're wrong? We're not. Samuel tried a different approach. Could you just run another scan? Just to check? Walker actually laughed, not unkindly. Do you know how much a full genetic workup costs? We can't waste resources double-checking the algorithm every time someone has a feeling. The whole point of the evaluators is efficiency. Samuel left the data room with his chest tight and his hands shaking. Walker had listened, sort of, but listening wasn't the same as believing. To him, Samuel was just a kid with feelings about an animal, someone who didn't understand the science. He tried Mr. Miller next, catching the senior technician near the feed storage. Miller was built like the cattle he worked with, broad and practical, with hands that looked like they'd never touched a keyboard in their life. Mr. Miller, I need to talk to you about the calf scheduled for termination this afternoon. Miller barely glanced at him. Not my department, kid. Talk to the evaluators. I did. They won't listen. But there's something wrong with the assessment. The calf's leg. The evaluators made the call. That's above my pay grade, and definitely above yours. Miller hoisted a feed bag onto his shoulder. Your dad know you're bothering people instead of staying where you're supposed to be? Samuel felt heat rise in his face. I'm not bothering anyone. I'm trying to save. You're trying to do a job that's not yours. Go find your father, son. The dismissal stung worse than anger would have. Miller didn't even think Samuel was worth arguing with. He found Frank in the equipment maintenance bay, then Henry in the transport staging area. Neither would listen past the first sentence. To them, Samuel was the janitor's kid, someone who existed in their peripheral vision, useful only for staying out of the way. By 11 a.m., Samuel had tried 6 different people, 6 different ways of explaining what he'd seen, 6 different versions of the same dismissal. The clock kept moving. 4 hours left. Samuel finally found his father in the West Wing corridor, methodically cleaning windows that probably didn't need cleaning. Daniel worked with the steady rhythm of someone who'd learned to make invisible tasks last long enough to justify his presence. Dad, I need your help. Daniel looked at his son, then at his watch, then back at Samuel. You're supposed to be in the break room doing homework. Dad, please, they're going to kill that calf this afternoon and the system made a mistake. I know it did. But nobody will listen to me because... His voice cracked. Because I'm nobody. His father set down the cleaning spray carefully, the way he did everything carefully. Samuel, listen to me. These people, they've spent years studying genetics, animal science, things we don't understand. The evaluators cost this company millions to develop. You think a 12-year-old noticed something all those experts missed? Yes. The word came out quieter than Samuel intended, but certain. Daniel's expression softened into something that looked like pity. Son, I know you're smart. I know you pay attention, but this isn't our world. We clean the floors and cash the paychecks and we don't tell people how to do their jobs. That's how we survive here. But what if they're wrong? They're not. How do you know? His father's pause was long enough that Samuel thought he might actually be considering the question. Then, because if they were wrong, someone important would have noticed by now. Samuel felt something crack inside his chest, something that might have been hope or maybe just the last bit of childish belief that being right mattered more than being important. I need to get back to work. His father picked up the spray bottle. "You should go do your homework. And Samuel, stop bothering the staff. Mr. Miller already complained about you." Samuel walked away before his father could see the tears burning behind his eyes. He made it to the janitor's closet, to the cot that smelled like industrial cleaner and loneliness before they fell. He'd tried everything. He'd told everyone who would listen and several who wouldn't. He'd explained what he'd seen, what he knew to be true. And nobody cared. Because he was the janitor's son. Because he was 12. Because invisible people didn't get to expose flaws in multi-million-dollar systems. The clock on the wall showed 12:17 p.m., 2 hours and 43 minutes until they came for Behemoth. Samuel lay on the cot staring at the ceiling tiles his father had probably cleaned 1,000 times, and he realized something that felt like swallowing broken glass. In this building, in this world, truth didn't matter nearly as much as authority. He could be right about everything, and it wouldn't make a single difference. Unless. Samuel sat up slowly, an idea forming that was probably stupid, definitely dangerous, and absolutely his last option. If nobody would listen to him, maybe he needed to make them see for themselves. He had 2.5 hours to do something so undeniable that even people who ignored janitors' kids couldn't look away. He just had to figure out what that something was. Samuel broke into the evaluation lab through a door his father never locked properly. His hands shook as he accessed the guest terminal using credentials he'd memorized from watching over shoulders. The Evaluators database opened. He found Behemoth's file in seconds. Right front leg, bone density 847 units. System threshold, 850 units. Status, compromised, 3 units. The difference between life and death was 3 microscopic units. Samuel pulled up comparison files, every calf born in the past year. He sorted by bone density. 42 calves had scored between 845 to 852 units on initial scans. Of those, 37 had been rescanned within 24 hours due to protocol. Every rescan showed different numbers. All 37 calves now thrived in breeding programs. Behemoth never got a second scan. Samuel printed everything and ran. The birthing suite was occupied. Thompson stood with the processing team, injection prepared. Behemoth stood in the corner, his mother between him and the humans. "Stop!" Samuel's voice cracked through the room. Thompson's expression went from surprise to irritation. "What are you doing here? Security?" Samuel thrust papers forward. "You made a mistake. Look at these scans." "Security. Remove him. His bone density was 3 units below threshold. Every other borderline case got rescanned except him." Samuel's voice rose. "You violated your own protocol." Thompson paused. "What?" 42 calves, all within margin of error, all rescanned, all approved. Samuel held out evidence. "Behemoth was rejected on a single scan. You never gave him a second chance." Johnson took the papers. His expression changed as he read. "James, look at this." Thompson snatched the pages, reading with increasing tension. Silence filled the room. "Who authorized you to access evaluation records?" "Nobody." Samuel's voice steadied. "Because nobody would listen when I said you were wrong." Thompson's face flushed. "This is a breach of—" "Run another scan." Samuel looked directly at him. "Right now. If I'm wrong, I'll leave. But if the scan shows different numbers, you admit the system failed." The two men looked at each other. The processing team stood frozen. Johnson spoke quietly. "Get the scanner." The portable scanner hummed in Mr. Walker's hands. He'd been called from the data wing, his expression mixing confusion and hope. The processing team stood ready, injection prepared. Samuel's father had arrived, summoned by security, face pale knowing his son had just risked everything. Thompson crossed his arms. "This is highly irregular." "So is terminating without protocol," Johnson said quietly, holding Samuel's evidence. "Run the scan, Walker." Walker approached Behemoth carefully. The massive calf watched but didn't shy away. The scanner passed over his right front leg 3 times. Walker stared at his screen. His hand shook. "What does it say?" Thompson's voice was sharp. "Bone density 891 units. Walker looked up, ashen. 41 units above threshold. Well within normal range. No structural compromise. Silence crashed through the room. Thompson snatched the tablet, reading. His jaw worked soundlessly. How is that possible? Johnson asked. Samuel found his voice. Position, hydration, time of day. Protocol says borderline scans need verification within 24 hours. You skipped that. Walker examined the original scan. Timestamp shows 4:18 a.m., less than 30 minutes after birth. Protocol recommends minimum 2 hours for stabilization. He paused. Someone rushed this. Thompson's face flushed. We had 12 calves that night, behind schedule. I made a judgment call. You made a mistake. Johnson's voice was quiet but final. Almost cost us the healthiest calf in 5 years. He turned to Samuel, really looking at him for the first time. Not as the janitor's kid, as the person who saved Genesis. How did you know? I watched him. His leg worked perfectly. When nobody listened, I figured maybe the system saw something that wasn't there. Samuel paused. Or missed something that was. Thompson walked out without a word. Johnson dismissed the processing team. Walker stopped beside Samuel. You accessed restricted files without authorization. Serious violation. He paused. You also exposed a critical protocol flaw. I think those balance out. Only 3 remained. Samuel, his father, and Johnson. The director watched Behemoth investigating his hay, unaware he'd been minutes from death. The system isn't infallible, Johnson said. We built everything on that assumption. The system is only as good as the data and people using it, Samuel said quietly. Johnson looked at Daniel. Your son saved this facility from catastrophic error, showed more courage than my entire team. He paused. He also broke 6 security protocols. Daniel's voice came rough. I understand if you need to terminate my employment. I'm not terminating anything. I'm creating a new position, junior data analyst, part-time, around school, pay grade 7. He looked at Samuel. Interested? Samuel could only nod. Report Monday. We need someone who questions what everyone accepts. Johnson headed out, then stopped. The system said Behemoth was worthless. You proved it wrong. Don't stop doing that. After he left, Samuel and his father stood in silence. Finally, Daniel spoke. I taught you to be invisible. I know. I was wrong. His voice cracked. Sometimes being seen is what matters. Samuel looked at Behemoth, massive, powerful, alive because someone invisible refused to stay quiet. Yeah, he said softly. Sometimes it is.